Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Unpacking the Word. This is the podcast where we dive deeper into what it means to live in an ethnocidal society and how we can combat that by creating sustainable culture. I'm Luna, and I'm joined by my co-host Barrett.
Hey. And so I'm going. So this week we're going to talk about, and it's not a laughing matter. We're going to talk about the school shooting that happened in Tennessee last week. We're recording this on April 7th, and we're also going to talk about what happened in the Tennessee State Legislature on Thursday, April 6th. And so, as we know that the shooting last week, a person went into Covenant School in Nashville and killed 6 people. In a matter of about 15 minutes, they shot over 150 rounds of bullets, gunfire. And, it's another example of how America's gun laws and our relationship with guns and our lack of desire to keep schools and children safe is catastrophic. And then on top of that, in response to that, Nashville residents had a protest at the state legislature, which is in Nashville, and 3 state representatives participated in that. And then on Thursday, there was a vote to expel those 3: Justin Pearson, Justin Jones, and I believe Gloria Johnson was the woman's name. And unsurprisingly, the Tennessee legislature voted to expel the 2 men who were young African Americans, and they did not expel the white woman. So the motivations for their action couldn't be more crystal clear. It fell along a racial line, and it's from the state that was the birthplace of the Ku Klux Klan. So it all kind of lines up. And so we have this convergence of gun violence and racism in a matter of a week and a half, 2 weeks, and it's just abundantly clear.
Yeah, and I think it's also just really clear that, we elect these people, right? Essentially, we are their bosses, and when this kind of when they're in solidarity, right, with protesters who are protesting gun violence, like that is kind of them doing their job, right? Like it's their job to represent like our interests. And it's very clear, or it should be very clear to Republicans that like our interests are not, more gun violence, right? I mean, the incident that happened last week killed 6 people, like a janitor, 3 kids who were all 9, and that is such a young age, to lose somebody. But it's like both fascinating and frustrating that Republicans refuse to acknowledge this kind of ethnocidal violence, right? This like culture of gun regulation or lack thereof,
Yeah.
right? So, I mean, Barrett, you've also wrote a lot about how the Second Amendment and like this idea, this concept of freedom and liberty in America, like it conflicts. So can you talk a little bit more about like what is so conflicting to like America about gun safety, gun violence prevention, and this idea of freedom?
Yeah, I can talk about that a lot. And so for example, after this shooting happened, I teach a class at George Washington University, and this week we were talking about I was talking to them about George Orwell, and he has this great book called Why I Write, and one of the structures in the book about how he articulates why you write is, there's 4 points. One point is you have like an ego. You have a inner desire to get your voice out. He kind of calls that sheer egoism. The next one is like aesthetic enthusiasm. You just want to like write beautiful words or whatever. You want it to be pretty. The third part is historical impulse, like history. There's a connection to history in your writing. And the fourth part is you have a political purpose, and that's political not in you are aligned with a political party, but you want your words to incline people to do something. Like you want it to, if you are doing good work, you would love it that your written work inclines people to do good things. Really, really simple. And so I'm bringing this up because when we talk about gun violence in the US, and we talk about most things in the US, we don't have a connection to history. It's all very much like our immediate response, our emotions, and calls to like morality or ethics to resolve it. But there's no like clarity about the history of the society and to help explain why these things happen. And I think that's a really glaring oversight. And so when we're talking about the Second Amendment, most of the time we talk about the idea of it and how people like to articulate that this is a good idea, that this idea is an idea that maintains freedom. But there's no historical connection as to like why it exists and how it's been used and impacted and shaped America for hundreds of years. And so, a key thing is like the Second Amendment was created so that Americans could defend themselves against the British. Like the North was really worried, brand new country. Britain wasn't that happy that we said we're not going to be a part of you anymore, that the British might come back and try to take over again. And since there wasn't a organized army in the sense that we have today, citizens needed to have the capacity to arm themselves. And, then they could form a well-regulated militia where someone could kind of essentially make like an impromptu military force to fight the British. Like that's what it's for. But the South wasn't worried about a British invasion. Like the British weren't going and storming the coasts of North Carolina and Georgia and South Carolina. That just wasn't what was happening. And so the South needed guns to oppress African Americans, to continue the ethnocidal system of chattel slavery. And if you look at the demographics of the South, a lot of these states are about 40-60 black white, some about 50-50. After the Civil War, once a lot of white people, Confederates, died in the war, some of these states had a greater percentage of African Americans in it. And so in these states, guns were a tool to sustain the terrorism of chattel slavery. And for those white people that lived there, those guns were the tool for their iteration of freedom, which was an iteration of freedom that was dependent upon terrorizing another group of people in perpetuity. And so now, following Reconstruction and the work that the South has engaged in to rebrand themselves and to have like non-racist language for objectives that would have racist outcomes, you then have all sorts of stuff that having a gun is an extension of freedom. Not that having a gun is the tool for terror that it's always been in the South, but that it's something that is a tool that you can exercise your conservative or libertarian, whatever ideas of freedom. And so it's really like an Orwellian kind of like double speak, where you're saying that like terrorism and freedom are one and the same. Like the capacity to terrorize people with a gun is an extension of your freedom. Right. It's dystopian in an Orwellian sense, just textbook. And we've heard that narrative for a very long time. And people don't seem to be surprised that we hear it. But we also, when gun violence like this happens in the school, since we don't have a historical context, people are surprised that something like this could be acceptable. And it's like, it's always been acceptable. It's just that they were terrorizing like communities of color. Now that terrorism is impacting everybody, and now they're talking about how problematic it is. But if you have a narrative, a philosophy that articulates that the capacity to terrorize other people is an extension of your freedom, well, it's not going to be a far leap for that terror to jump across a racial line or to jump into some other community that you've called an other or something like that. It's the philosophy is that terrorism is an extension of freedom, and the South has articulated that since the inception of the United States, and we're seeing the manifestations of that right now. And it's quite tragic, but it's even more tragic that our society, we know so little about our history, that stuff that we can very easily understand is shocking and surprising because we just don't know what we've already done. You know,
Right. The capacity for tolerance of such violence has always been present in history. And now that it's, impacting kids.
so I guess the thing is, if you think about it, in the 1800s, they were using these guns to terrorize black children. And if you think about Jim Crow, they were terrorizing black children at that time too. It's just that the narrative that America had is like, if we're just not going to tell those stories, or we'll come up with some narrative that these people somehow deserve it, or it's their fault that this happened, or something. So now it seems like a thing that our society can tolerate. But once you have that cultural norm of using terrorism as an extension of your freedom, it's inevitable that is going
Right.
to extend to other people, to other
Mm-hmm.
groups, and that people will use that narrative in random ways. Like anybody, like it's a narrative that people of any race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity could use. And so somebody that's having a really bad day and they think their life is horrible and they want to go out with an expression of American freedom, they may conclude that the way to like leave this world or to fully express themselves would be to implement terrorism on other people. And
Mm-hmm.
based on the narrative America's given since the beginning, like, you shouldn't be surprised when people draw that, catastrophic conclusion. And we're seeing a lot of that.
Right. And I mean, I think it's also like does it do us any justice or does it do us any good to also question the person's motives, because that act of terror, that act of violence has already been inflicted. And so I just feel like exploring or the media kind of questioning the person's, motives as to why, this school in particular, or as to why, like, in general, like why? I'm not too sure if that, does us any good.
What I'll say is, I think inquiring about people's motive makes sense. It's just that if you're looking for a solely individualistic motive, that this person just had
Mm,
some idea that's entirely their own, not influenced by society at all. It's just them going rogue in a completely inexplicable, unprecedented, irrational way. Well, there's no point in that, because if you're doing that and you're applying that kind of structure for each person, you're basically, the only thing you're trying to do is understanding after the terror has occurred. But
right.
if you're doing it in a collective way, like what in our society is inclining people to think and act this way? There has to be something that preceded that person's thoughts that has inclined them to think in a particular way. And that's where history comes into play. And if you live in a place that for hundreds of years has described terrorizing the other as an expression of your freedom, well, someone at some point is going to express this iteration or this distorted understanding of freedom and go terrorize people. That's just what's going to happen.
I like how you reframe that because I often feel like, reading a CNN article, it's like there have been X number of mass shootings this year. And it's like that data is useful, right? Those statistics are useful, but it also doesn't like there's a pattern of a culture here. Like we have a culture, a cultural pattern of like violence against marginalized communities, right? And like this idea, this notion of like doublespeak with American freedom and terrorism that like the media just doesn't talk about, right? And I think that's kind of where like we, like society, the media, kind of like it falls short, right? Of questioning the motives, right? Because it turns into an individualistic motive versus this individual was definitely influenced by this idea of American freedom and terrorism. And like you said, the way that they wanted to express this American freedom was through an act of traditional terrorism
Yeah.
that we will mask as, something that only like a lone wolf kind of scenario, right?
Yeah, and,
Yeah.
and and this is what happens when you have a discourse with your society that doesn't talk about history. And history is just
Yeah.
existence that happened the day before, or
Mm,
years
mm-hmm.
before. It's super relevant. But if you don't incorporate that into your thinking, then everything is just random. Everything is just like inexplicable. Everything's a surprise because you can't have a precedent. And so that's why we'll have these weird conversations about gun violence where we'll talk about each action as if it's a random act while also talking about how often it happens. Like, how does that make sense? How can these be all be random and have no cultural connective tissue when we do it all the time?
Yeah,
Like,
exactly.
it just doesn't
Exactly.
make sense. It's like it's completely irrational, and we will have these irrational conversations about gun violence and not realize that that's what we're doing, and then be surprised when it happens again, and then we'll have the another irrational conversation and another surprise, and then we'll have this data that we say, oh, look at all this data that we have. Hopefully, this will help us explain what's going on, but it clearly doesn't. It's just greater
Right.
awareness that we keep on doing this thing that we don't want to understand. We haven't figured out how to understand it. And the way to figure out how to understand it is just by looking at the past and coming to like the unfortunate reality that we've just done this for the entire
Yeah.
time that the country's been around. This is not a surprise. And if you give a society that has for a very long time articulated that terrorism as an extension of your freedom, and you make it easier for all these people to get handguns and get AR-15s, it's clearly going to ramp up more violence because more people will want to exercise this corrupted concept of freedom. And you know and if you look at these conservatives who are all about the Second Amendment, which many of these conservatives are from the South for a very long time has been very fond of the Second Amendment, not because they cared about a British invasion, but because they needed it to control enslaved people for the first 60 some odd years of the United States. And then they used the Second Amendment to then create the Ku Klux Klan and all these terrorist entities.
Mm-hmm.
And then once they were undoing Reconstruction, they needed the Second Amendment to try to put black people back in their place, as they would say. And then they used Jim Crow to then sustain that terroristic status quo, where then African Americans end up fleeing the South in droves to get rid of the terrorism. And then the Civil Rights Movement showed up, and next thing you know, they started using guns to terrorize anybody that was advocating for civil rights for African Americans and all sorts of people. After that, we're talking about all sorts of stuff like war on drugs, war on this, war on that. So there's been a whole cultural narrative about guns being a necessary thing to sustain this type of freedom that's interwoven with terrorism. And now you just let civilians have access to these tools for terror, and they're going to go try to be what America has told them what freedom is. And
Exactly. Right.
it's very logical. It's bleak. It forces you to like change your perspective of the place in which we live, but is the is the preference to be delusional and imagine that the place is
Mm,
great, while you then
Mm-hmm.
are left like defenseless, like psychologically. You can't even imagine how to solve the problem of just randomly getting shot wherever you go? Or would it be better to be aware of the society in which you live so that you can at least start having the conversations about how to solve the problem because the problem has been identified?
Right. And it is bleak. I mean, yeah, that was incredibly bleak. And I think it's also when people demand change or they start to turn towards that change, right? The change that is absolutely needed for like a cultural revolution of some sorts, they get penalized. And I mean, we saw that, right, with these two Nashville, Tennessee state representatives. They were penalized by getting expelled from the House last night. And it was, on party lines. Tennessee is dominated by Republicans. Not dominated by, but the majority of Tennessee state representatives are Republican. And it was very clear that it was also like an act of racism or ethnocide, and that they didn't want these two outspoken African American state representatives to, you know, to do their job. Like it also just blows my mind in any other, you know, at any other workplace for any other job, people who do their jobs get to keep their jobs. And both of those state representatives were doing their job of representing the people's interest, right? And yet they were fired. Yeah, they were expelled from doing their jobs. And I mean,
So, as I was watching the news coverage on it last night, I noticed that a decent amount of people finally were talking about Reconstruction in response
mm,
to what happened. Which, as you know, I've been talking about this forever, and it's not something people are that aware of. But what they were saying
mm-hmm,
is how once Reconstruction ended, and the federal troops were taken out of the South, and the former Confederates now had greater influence in state legislatures and whatnot, they started finding any way they could to remove black congressmen from the legislature. They would anything breaking, some minor infraction, you're out. Some this, we're going to gerrymander that, and now your district is, and you're going to. And so over the course of the years following Reconstruction, all these black congressmen just were removed from the legislature. And, we're talking 1877 here. By the turn of the century, by 1900, all these legislatures were just all white. And then next, Jim Crow starts. And so seeing these Republican congressmen find a way to expel two young African Americans from the legislature made people think about how this is how conservatives, Southern white men behaved at the end of Reconstruction as they tried to undo all the progress of those 12 years so that they could then create Jim Crow. It's like, yes, that's exactly what's happening. This is
yeah,
the American cycle, as we've been talking about. And we know you and I did a podcast on those stages already. And so this is the cycle. Like all the progress that Barack Obama created, which I view to be the second Reconstruction. Clearly, the Republicans are trying to undo that from the beginning. And then Donald Trump was a really firm attempt at trying to undo all that progress. Now, Joe Biden is trying to continue the work of Obama with, clearly his own philosophy. But the philosophy of the conservatives is to continue to undo all of that progress. And that's not just progress regarding like women's rights or the Affordable Care Act or any of that kind of stuff. It's the progress of we don't want certain voices in these spaces. So we need to gerrymander the state legislature. We need to find any type of excuse we can to remove essentially non-white people, in particular, to African Americans from the legislature. And that's what they did. And they did it because those people were speaking on behalf of the people. And that's not what they want. they want to control the legislature and do whatever they want, just like in the pre-Civil War antebellum South. 40% of the population of those states had zero representation. And when black people got in it during Reconstruction, their voice was to represent those people who had been oppressed for 60 some odd years in the U.S., but oppressed since 1619. And they steadfastly worked to remove all those voices back then, and they're doing the same thing right now. It's like, this is just basic American history. And when you live in a society that doesn't want anyone to know about the history, you then get shocked by people doing what they've always done. And that's
Right.
pretty bleak.
It is. Yeah. And I mean, it's the end of the state legislator session in Nashville, like it's coming up. Like I think it ends in May. So ousting these like lawmakers in the final weeks means that you leave thousands of their residents without representation.
And they
That
couldn't
is
care less.
incredibly bleak. They could not care less. And I mean, like Tennessee is, like it's a predominantly red state. I'm sure that I think there's a lot of anti-trans bills that are either passing or have been introduced. That's straight up just ethnocide, wanting to erase, yeah, somebody's identity essentially, um,
And
and their culture. Yeah.
if you look at Tennessee as a state, like Nashville and Memphis are like the two big cities, and that's where those two of the representatives were from. And now these
And
Republic,
representing.
yeah,
Yeah.
they're representing these big cities in Tennessee, the cosmopolitan places where most of the jobs are, most of the money goes in there, all the business. So the areas
Right.
that are actually like the lifeblood of the state, like economically and largely culturally. If you're thinking about music, like talking
Yeah.
about country music,
Food.
that's Nashville.
Mm-hmm.
Also Memphis, like Elvis, like
Right. Yeah.
these are like the pinnacle places of Tennessee. And the Republicans who, for the most part, are and like representing the more rural parts of the state, they don't care if those places don't get representation, but they still want to control those places. And there's a whole bunch of stuff that Republicans are doing right now to like try to take over and control Nashville. They were talking about it last night on the news about how like the Republicans wanted to have their 2014 convention in Nashville, and Nashville said no, like we don't want you here. Like this is a left leaning. We don't want that. And now they're
Yeah.
the Republicans are just upset about that and just trying to like take power and rechange the city government in Nashville because they're just angry and they want to control the city. It's like these are the type of people that they're dealing with, and it's not surprising that they would behave this way because historically this is how they've always behaved. It's just
Exactly.
real simple. And so it's it's not positive, but you can't have a solution to the problem until you recognize what the problem is. And I think far too often we try to have solutions to the problem while never fully recognizing what the problem is. And you're
Mm-hmm.
never going to have a solution then. It's just impossible. And the problem is that we've just been an ethnocidal place from the beginning. We work to destroy the culture of the other so that one group of people, essentially like white men, can just control the society with a complete disregard of the will of the people. Like I was reading this one book, and they propose this idea, this concept that's called like monstrous government. And monstrous government is when the people and the government as a whole confuse the public with the private, where stuff that should be public is treated as if it's private space. That's like when a monstrous government happens. And so like you look at this Tennessee state legislature, the speeches last night by Justin Pearson and Jones, and Rep Johnson, they were talking about how this has become just like a boys club. It's like a Republican club. It's basically the legislature is supposed to be the public's house, and they're treating it as if it's a private institution that's just run by Republicans. Monstrous government. You know, the idea that they want governments to run like a business. They think their government should run like a private enterprise. Monstrous government. And we saw it yesterday. Like, that was a monstrosity. What those conservatives thought was just perfectly normal and made sense because they want the state legislature to be their private club. And they're going to gerrymander the state and expel people who are different than them so that they can have their private club, which is the government. And that's a monstrosity. And so, like, that's where we're at. And that's where we've been for a very long time.
Yeah, I like that framing. And it does remind me too of Ayanna Pressley and how she also talks about like policy violence, right? Like instituting these cultural values that Republicans have of maintaining power within really only cis white men, right? But implementing policies and codifying that into law, right? So that it's almost indestructible. How can you combat policy violence, right? If cultural change especially takes some time, right? It doesn't happen overnight. And sometimes it often can feel like policy violence or the lack of like policy protections can happen overnight or with a simple judge ruling or with a majority quote unquote vote, right? So,
Like last podcast, we were talking about like common good and common space. And,
mhm,
democracy is essentially a government that's based around being built from a common space. Like if we can have this common space idea of people, a community coming together in a common environment and discussing and deciding what's best for the community because there's a common people, a common good. If we can grow that and scale that up, then we can have a democracy. Like that's the general idea. But the US has never wanted to do that. They've wanted to have a divided society, ethnocidal, where there isn't a common space, and that the divided society, then the people who cause the division, they want to then proclaim that their private space is the same thing as the common space. And that's a monstrous government. And so that's why you'll
mhm,
have concepts where like gun violence and terrorism will be articulated as an expression of freedom because the common space that these like monstrous legislatures, monstrous individuals are creating is one that can only be sustained by keeping the other people out of it. And so that's what's happening. Like we're now from the get-go, we've been describing a private space, a space that like white colonizers created on purpose to be their private space as a public space. And now we're being surprised that they are not letting their private space become the public space that in name it always claimed to be, but in actions it never was. And like
right.
that's it's monstrous from the get-go, and it's a cultural problem because we're now saying that the private is public. That's doublespeak. And if we're saying the private's public, we're also saying that, terrorism is freedom. And now there's no real capacity to distinguish right and wrong because they're going to say something bad is something good. These Republicans are going to say that expelling these two young black men was a good thing. And the justification that they're
Because
saying for
apparently they violated decorum. So,
something, they don't need
right.
to have a justification because if you are the opposite of what you are, then it doesn't nothing needs to make sense anymore. If doing a bad thing is also doing a good thing, then the reason for why you expel them doesn't need to make sense, and you can still say that your nonsensical argument makes sense because you have just arbitrarily decided that it does. And if you have enough power that you can do nonsensical stuff and not lose power, do you need to make sense? Not really. And like that's how like a private monstrous government functions when they say the private is the public and they have control of the private space. And so it's private space and I have control over it. And people get mad if I say it's private space. So I'll say it's public space. Maybe they'll like it better then. Doesn't matter. If they think it's public space and it makes them like less inclined to get rid of me, then I'll call it public space while it's my private space. And I'll sustain that monstrosity forever. And that's what's happening. And, they clearly want to keep their power at the expense of the safety of little kids in schools and the terror and trauma that's being inflicted upon constituents and Americans all across the country. They just don't care. And they haven't ever cared.
So long as they're the ones in power and can keep making those decisions to keep
100%.
themselves in power. Yeah.
Yep.
It's been a really bleak conversation, Barrett, and I definitely want to land on something a little bit lighter. So,
All
is
right.
there something Evtopian that you're going to do this weekend? Despite all of this bad shit that's going on.
So, so yeah, sure, I'll do something Evtopian, but it'd be pretty simple. Um, so like this week, my partner, she went on some business trip, and in this business trip, they had all these like community organizers, and they asked them if you had a guaranteed success, that like no matter what, your success was guaranteed, what would you ask for? And a lot of these people ask for really small things. If it was for immigration, they'd say, secure pathways to citizenship, or they'd say, Medicaid for everybody, but not like like a universal healthcare system that everyone had that was great. They were like improvements on Medicaid. When it came to uh when it came to citizenship, it was a greater pathway, not just like blanket citizenship for undocumented. Like their ideas weren't that big. And it's like that was she contacted me. She's like, this is fascinating. Like they were given the opportunity to have guaranteed success, and all they had were these just really small ideas.
Oh,
And
wow.
yeah, and I was like, and I told her, I was like, the reason that's the case is our society doesn't have a clarity about like what like an actionable lived good is. Like people aren't sure how to do it. Good is really like a theoretical thing. They're not really aware
Yeah.
of how to live in it. And so like I've been saying this for ages, and it's sometimes you need those big stark moments where you're in a room full of like 100 people and you ask them like what your ideal with a guaranteed victory is, and it's real small. And you're like,
Yeah.
wow. They're scared to live in a good place to the extent where they can't even imagine what it is.
Exactly.
It's
Exactly. That's
it's
so, it's disappointing a little bit. Yeah,
oh,
just to hear that.
it's so disappointing. And so when you ask about like what Evtopian thing I'm gonna do, it's fascinating because like I can think of the big thing because I have a word for what like a lived good is. So therefore I can
Mm-hmm.
just do it. I could do the lived good in a really small level. I could do it in a really big level. If someone asked me that question that was prompted to those people, I'm gonna say something real big, because I can imagine it.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
my partner, she was just in the room, just like, what is happening? She came up with like big
Right.
ideas, and she came up with big ideas because like we do Evtopian stuff. There's a word. Once you can say the word, it's easy to imagine the big thing you can do because you can talk, you can communicate it to other people, you can communicate it to yourself. It's not a strange thing, and it's not an idea that has to derive from something that already exists. It could be bigger than that. Like you can make it. And so when it comes to Evtopian stuff, like what I'm going to do this weekend, at the bare minimum, I'm probably going to have a bunch of ideas that other people couldn't even come up with when they're prompted with guaranteed success. And I'm going to not know how to like exist without them. Like I'm not going to know how to not think about how to do things in like a lived experiential good. And that's going to
Mm-hmm.
impact how I talk to everybody. That's going to impact how I interact with my kid. It's going to impact how I clean my house. It's going to impact the newsletter I'll do my best to write this weekend, you know? And so, like when we're talking about the school shootings and the bleakness of American history and the expulsion of those two reps, you can see that a lot of what's happening here is people responding to something really bad happening
Yeah,
and continuing to fight and continuing to want that bad thing to not happen. But we don't have the conversation about how to do good because we don't have
yeah,
the language. And a lot of people can't even imagine how to do it when prompted. And so, like, what I'm going to do as an Evtopian expression is just think about and articulate and act in a good way and know that people that can think and act like that too and can articulate it will do that to me too. So even if I make a mistake, like even if I don't do the dishes when I'm supposed to, they know that he'll still do it. you know it's still
yeah,
so like that's what I'll do as an Evtopian expression is just try to proactively live in a good way and be able to articulate that to myself and other people, which the more and more I watch the news and hear how other people perceive stuff, you find out that like that's not normal. That's not a thing that a lot of
yeah,
people do, which is
right.
wild.
It kind of is. It kind of is.
And
Yeah.
so what's an Evtopian thing that you'll do, Luna?
I'm gonna cheat a little bit.
Oh,
So, I teach high school and it's a dual enrollment class, so they get both college and high school credit. And so, actually, their high school sociology teacher got contacted by this environmental justice organization. And they said, hey, we're doing a student advocacy day, like for you all to kind of come down to the state capitol to lobby state legislators to do the right thing and to pass, environmentally just bills, right? And so the sociology teacher reached out and was like, I have a lot of my students are in your class, so like, do you want to come with us and be a chaperone and also, just like make sure that the kids understand kind of like the importance of lobbying and things like that. So I said, sure, why not? So this happened on Wednesday, and we actually marched to the state capitol from like a college campus nearby. And when we got to the state capitol, there were students of East High School like already on the capitol steps. And if folks haven't heard, like there have been two shootings at East High School in the past 4 months, and it has killed two students. The first shooting I think happened in January, and a student was like in his car, and he got shot at, and he was on life support for 2 weeks before his family ultimately decided to pull him off life support. And I mean, the school is in mourning, right? And then 3 weeks ago or so, a student who was flagged by the school administration and by teachers for having kind of like a volatile, violent personality, he was checked for weapons and for like materials that could harm students every morning. And, it was like a body search on him every single morning going to school. And it felt, I mean, from the outside looking in, like it very much so felt like he was already in prison and treated like a prisoner, treated like a criminal because he was body searched every morning, instead of alternative resources like a counseling, check in every morning with like a counselor instead. No, he was body searched and he fired at two deans of the school. And, then he ran, and later on in the day, he was actually found dead um, after like a few couple miles away from the school. So, like, East High School has been protesting and on the steps of the state capitol every day since their spring break, which was like 2 weeks ago. And so we like this group of students who are lobbying for environmental justice or like marching to the state capitol. And we just kind of like convene with East High School, and they're outside of the state capitol steps, like just trying to get their legislators to listen to them, to like what we just talked about, end gun violence and stop this like conflation of like American freedom with terrorism, right? And I just thought that it was really cool to see, like just two different groups who had no idea, that the other was going to be there. And we just kind of merged to like basically, and it sounds reactive, but I think, to basically fight for like our fundamental rights, right? Like we should be able to have access to like safe environments, whether that's like clean water and air or like just not the fear of dying from a random gunshot, like you, or from like a random act of gun violence, like you had said earlier, Barrett. And yeah, I'm just going to be thinking a lot about that this weekend, right? Like, how do we build like better, tangible, attainable futures for everybody?
And maybe have an exercise to see like what those kids can envision, like maybe have the same
Yeah,
prompt, because I will say my partner, she was quite stunned at the lack of vision that was articulated in the room at the time. And it's like you would have expected that there'd be more vision, but I think much of the US spends a lot of time in response to tragedy that you don't have time to think about the big goal or what like a clarity
you
of what
don't.
good is.
Yeah,
You're too busy thinking about like good being the absence of a thing that you know is bad. Well, what if that thing you know is bad is gone? How do you do a good thing? What's good then look like? That's a thought that like a lot of people just don't have. So, as you're thinking about this weekend, you have a mass of impressionable young people and that are clearly being traumatized. And
yeah,
that trauma, it's very easy for that to be the thing that consumes how they relate to the world and how they see everything. So,
absolutely.
you know, giving them an utopian alternative could be pretty decisive. So, all right. I think that's the episode. I think we ended on a slightly better note.
I think so too. Thank you, everyone, so much for listening. Please be sure to follow us on socials at SCL_community and subscribe to The Word, which is our Substack newsletter.
Thanks for coming. Bye.
Thanks so much, everyone.